Work hard and play harder.
And that's just the goal with the Sharp Football Analysis podcast, is to discover and uncover new ways to analyze football, and then share that information and disseminate that material in an easy to understand manner. And then at that point, all you got to do is let the Marshawn Lynch principle take over. Yeah, that is, when we do it so constantly, so frequently, and so repetitively, and so accurately, even those who hate analytics, even the cynics and the skeptics, it just will click in their mind that they're so worn down and frustrated they will have to sit down and listen to reason. And that is the Marshawn Lynch principle. Because like he says,
if you just run through somebody's face, a lot of people ain't gonna be able to take that over and 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 over again. They just not gonna want that.
Think there's a deeper metaphor there?
Run through a face, then you don't have to worry about them no more.
welcome into the Week 2 edition of the Sharp Football Analysis podcast. My name is Warren Sharp of sharpfootballanalysis.com. And guys, if you're anything like me whatsoever, you really enjoyed that Week 1 opening slate. I don't know that we will find another slate this entire football season that features as many competitive and close games as what we saw on Sunday for Week 1. The only real game that was not competitive whatsoever was the Eagles-Browns game. But pretty much every single other game there was competitive. Some teams had huge leads and the game was not competitive for a while. The Lions were up by 18, had to come back to win that game. The Chargers were up by 21 and ended up losing that game in overtime. But for the most part, Sunday's games were tremendous. The Thursday night game was great as well, with the Broncos pulling out that victory over the Panthers when the Panthers missed the field goal at the very end, and the Broncos were able to win that by 1 point. Of course, all good things must come to an end, and the Monday night games were pretty terrible, particularly after halftime. Obviously, the first half was a little bit interesting to see how those games were shaping up, but once halftime hit, the two teams that were dominating there, the Steelers and the 49ers, really just took hold in the second half. So with that said, what are we going to do on this particular podcast? Well, this one's coming out on a Wednesday, and what I want to do is go ahead and kind of review the schedule for what we're going to be doing with the concept and these podcasts as we go over the course of the season. So you last heard this podcast on Saturday. That is a podcast that will be recurring every single week with our special guest, Evan Silva of rotoworld.com. We go on Friday night, he and I sit down and record that podcast. That is a deep, deep dive into the analytics and the matchups for a number of games. We will be talking DFS, we'll be talking sports betting, and we'll basically be trying to break down and prognosticate games, usage rates, everything that has to do with statistics and what we think is going to happen from a matchup-based perspective for the upcoming games. So he and I record that thing on Friday. Typically, it's we're not off the phone until 1, 2 a.m. We just go crazy for maybe a couple of hours, trim it down to about an hour-long podcast, and by the time that hits, it's about Saturday morning. Now, the best thing about that for you guys, while we will also be producing content throughout the course of the week, and lots of other great podcasts out there go over the course of the week as well, this one is probably going to be the very last real information podcast that you're going to get of the week out of any of the podcasts that you subscribe to and listen to. And that's going to give you an edge with all these injuries that we've got, because the injury reporting situation now is different than it was before. Many more players are able to be reported as questionable. There is no more probable tag. And so it is going to take longer and it's going to be more difficult to try to understand the injury picture for the players and what is shaping up for the games on Sunday. So the fact that we can sit there and collect all the information, get all the latest and greatest from Evan's news sources and other sources, my sources as well, and then we come together late Friday night and record a podcast, that's going to really help you guys out on Saturday morning or Saturday afternoon when you're listening to it. So that podcast was the same as last year, is going to stay the same this year. The best information you're going to be able to get, most recent information before the games kick off of probably any podcast that you're subscribing to. Now, what are we going to do earlier in the week? Well, last year I typically released a detailed box score breakdown, the stats behind the stats, the deeper than the box score breakdown of all of these games, talking analytics, talking metrics, kind of teaching topics, things that I took away from what we saw in the prior week of games. What I'm going to do something a little bit differently than I did last year. Instead of hitting up like an hour-long podcast or so on Tuesday probably, which broke down the games, we're going to do things a little different. And I'm actually really, really excited about this. So pay attention to these two big announcements. Monday night, we're going to be doing a live Periscope podcast. So if you guys have ever been on Periscope before or are on Twitter, that's basically the way that you access Periscope. And here's the reason why I want to do something like this. For several years now, I've gone on about the lack of quality information in many of these pregame shows. There's just not tremendous information. We live in a modern era of instant media. Within seconds of an interesting play occurring in a game, I'm assuming, first of all, that most of you guys are on Twitter. If you're not, I really don't know what you're doing, because if you're playing daily fantasy, if you're betting on these games, if you're just screwing around with your friends and hanging out watching the games, there's no reason that in this day and age you should not have Twitter if you want to stay informed. So that's the first and foremost. But assuming that you do, there's instant highlights being tweeted out. So you don't have to wait and see Lamar Miller break off a huge run. You don't have to wait and see Drew Brees hit Brandon Cooks down the sideline for a 98-yard pass. You'll see that on your Twitter feed 30 seconds after it happens. You will see that play being retweeted. So there's no reason why we need to have all these preview shows that have tons of highlights. And that's pretty much what most of these preview shows are, is a lot of highlights, and then they go into just talking to ex-players about how they feel about the locker room situation, what they think about this particular coach, what this guy's doing controversial this week, what they think about the backup quarterback situation over here. And there's not really a lot that's actually going to teach you about the key takeaways that you need to know from what happened in the prior week's game. So what I've decided to do is a humble attempt to try to fill that void at least for 30 minutes. And every single Monday night, the 30 minutes before the game actually kicks off. So I believe the games are kicking off at 8:30. That means at 8 o'clock, we're going to be starting a live Periscope where you will see me breaking down some of the key takeaways from an advanced metrics or analytics perspective from the games on Sunday that you need to know coming out of Monday night and heading into the start of the upcoming week. And my thought basically is this: by 8 o'clock, these pregame shows, and I like to have them on in the background, and I'll watch them too, and because there's nothing else on. That is the football information that you're going to be getting at that point in time. So, but they're starting at like 7 o'clock. Some of them even start at 6:30. I don't know exactly, but these pregame shows start earlier and earlier every single year because they know people love football. They love information. They want to hear and talk about football. So people will tune in. Therefore, they start the shows earlier. But by the time we get around to 8 o'clock, all the good storylines have already been discussed for the game. All the good information that they really had on their agenda to share with you that they thought you were going to be really intrigued about, that's already out there. Then at 8 o'clock, they're starting to show more shots of players warming up on the field. Maybe they'll have a random couple of interviews with players or a coach. It's things that you don't really care about for the upcoming week. It's more pertinent to that particular game. That's why I'm starting this at 8 o'clock. Let you guys digest all the other good information, if there is some, that they're sharing with you prior in their show. By 8 o'clock, once the bulk of their great information has kind of filled up and moved on to more things that are just trying to get you amped and ready to start the game, you can tune into Periscope on your mobile device. Keep your TV on the broadcast, but hopefully you'll enjoy catching up with some of the analytics and the real data behind some of these games starting at 8 o'clock for about 30 minutes. And I will actually sometimes bring on a caller, bring on a special guest to that Periscope. This is something that I have not done before, but I'm excited to give it a shot and try it out. I hope that you guys are going to enjoy the information as well. So I encourage you, this is going to start week 2. So this upcoming Monday night, we are going to be starting this podcast. So mark it down, note it, 8 o'clock Monday night, tune in for the live Periscope. What I'm going to do then is take the audio from that Periscope and turn it into a podcast. So in case you missed the show, you missed the live Periscope, you'll be able to, I don't know when it goes up there, maybe Monday night, maybe Tuesday morning, you'll be able to catch that 30-minute segment as a short podcast. So that's going to be the first Sharp Football Analysis podcast of the week. It's probably going to be on Tuesday morning, but it's going to be a 30-minute spot that's going to come from the Periscope that I'm doing live on Monday night at 8 o'clock. There will be a second podcast of the week, assuming that I can do this on a regular basis, which I hope to do. And this kind of pertains to the big announcement number 2, which I'll talk about in a second. But the second podcast of the week, I'm going to try to do it on Wednesdays. And it's going to be a little bit shorter than what we've done in the past, where we do an hour-long podcast breaking down all the details of the games, because we're going to be going over some of that on this Monday night live Periscope at a very high level. We won't be digging down anywhere near to the depth that we were doing in our Tuesday podcast, but we'll still be giving you some of the key takeaways that you need. The Wednesday podcast, what I'm going to try to do is I'm calling it a Whiteboard Wednesday. And the reason I'm calling it a Whiteboard Wednesday is that this podcast, I'm actually going to be shooting, number one, a video of my desktop, as I'm walking through a new website that I developed called sharpfootballstats.com. And that's the big announcement number 2, which I'll talk about in a second. But let's discuss this podcast, the Whiteboard Wednesday podcast. It's obviously not happening this week because you're getting the Sharp Football Analysis podcast that we've done in the past, a little bit abbreviated. But in future weeks, starting week 2, we'll be doing this Whiteboard Wednesday podcast. So that's going to be a podcast which is primarily most helpful for you if you're following along in YouTube. Now, I'm going to be considerate of everybody who's just subscribing to this podcast and is only going to hear the audio. So we'll still try to hit all the points and talk about the items, but I'll be able to show you some visualizations from this new site as we walk through things on the YouTube video of the Whiteboard Wednesday podcast. And essentially its goal is going to be to help explain visually some of the things that happened last week, some of the trends, maybe even preview some of the upcoming matchups based on some of the trends and angles that we're seeing. And I don't mean trends like this particular team is 1-19 in its last 31 home games on grass after playing on Monday night on the road. Not trends like that nonsense. I'm talking about trends like this team has struggled tremendously to the left side of their defensive line. And if you look at the gains by the opponents when they run to that side, they have been tremendous. And this particular opponent runs the ball extremely well to that side. And I'm going to show you visually, as we're describing that verbally, what that looks like based upon all the information from sharpfootballstats.com. So I'm excited about that podcast as well. It's a concept. Hopefully it comes to fruition, but just wanted to get that out there as well. So bottom line, what are we looking at this year for content from Sharp Football Analysis Podcast? Number 1, it's going to be a live Periscope on Monday nights at 8 p.m. that will be turned into a short podcast, a 30-minute podcast that's going to be released either later Monday night or Tuesday morning on iTunes and the rest of the podcasting network. Number 2, we're going to try to get in a Wednesday whiteboard podcast that's going to go up on Wednesday. It's primarily going to be YouTube-based, but you'll also be able to follow along with it. It'll go on the stream for the Sharp Football Analysis podcast. You can get more information from me on Wednesday. And then we'll have the podcast with Evan Silva, which will be the longest podcast of the week. That will be recorded while you're sleeping or partying on Friday night, and it will be up there first thing for you guys on Saturday as early as we can get it up there. So that's 3 podcasts, if everything goes right, that's going to be going on this season every single week on a weekly basis. I'm really looking forward to all the content that we'll be able to share with you guys, and I hope that you guys are looking forward to that as well. All right, the big announcement number 2 has to do with Sharp Football Stats, and I am really excited about this project. And I'll go ahead and give you a little bit of background on it before I start sharing some information. Kind of the story behind this, preparing for data analysis every single week that I do, and I'm sure a lot of other people do during the course of the NFL season, it can get very cumbersome, very tedious at times. Sometimes you're getting data sourced that is sort of what you want, but not exactly what you want. Other times you're getting information that if you know exactly how to use it, it's helpful, but a lot of people out there probably don't know exactly how to use it, and it becomes very difficult for, I think, the masses to get this information that's actually useful. And then finally, a lot of times it takes a lot of time to run the various queries on websites to obtain the information. Some of these things would take 30 seconds, 20 seconds to run. And then if you have a slight modification or a tweak that you want to make to that information, that data that you're compiling, then it takes the entire length of time all over again. It's just a really brutal process to try to get this information at your fingertips quickly. The other problem is it gives you all the information in black and white text and columns on a website. And while having stats that you can reference in an article or comparison is helpful, a lot of times it doesn't allow you to quickly retain that information, quickly process it and retain it, figure out what is the most important takeaway from the information that you're looking at. So what I wanted to do this past off season, and it was kind of in addition to the football preview publication that I put out, this was my immediate next step. So as soon as I got that football publication out right after July 4th, my full attention turned to developing sharpfootballstats.com. And what I wanted out of sharpfootballstats.com is I wanted a site that users would be able to come to, myself included, to prepare and understand NFL information and use it to prepare for upcoming weeks of analysis. And so from that perspective, having that as my goal myself, I think I was able to build something that you guys will like from your side, because it's developed for what I wanted, and what I wanted is probably a lot like what you guys wanted as well, or will want as well. So what are some of the options here that make this site unique? Well, first and foremost, it's entirely built on visualizations. So it is completely defined by visually being able to see information and process and retain that information. The reason why seeing that information as opposed to just reading it in black and white text is helpful is because I truly believe in this era that we live in with multiple devices. People have iPads, iPhones, Androids, all the different types of devices. They have information at their fingertips. They have information coming through their watches. They've got TVs all around them, multiple computer monitors. We are a society that I think does better with visual learning as opposed to hearing something said to us or reading text. It's a lot easier to see and comprehend an image quickly. And I think we have, over the last decade or so, been more inclined to that style of learning and education. So just based upon the sources around us and the information that we're getting elsewhere, we have trained our brains to actually be better at processing pictures and information we visually see rather than that which we have to read. And so there are no real websites out there that really pictorially depict statistics for the NFL that are processed automatically and weekly for you guys to utilize. So this one is one of the first that is going to do that, sharpfootballstats.com. So that's kind of the high-level background. But I wanted to make it more than just a site that you could go to and see some cool pictures of the stats. I wanted it to be fully customizable so that you could go there and you could decide to choose whether or not you only wanted to look at this visualization for first down or you want to look at it for all downs. Whether you want to only look at it when a team's in the red zone or you want to look at it where they're all over the course of the field. Whether you want to look at it when they're throwing, then the quarterback's throwing to all his receivers, or you want to isolate it when he's throwing to just one particular person and you can choose which person that is. Or when you want to look at it when he's throwing just to his tight ends rather than to other positions. There's many ways that you're going to be able to customize this data and this information. So that kind of is the second step to it. It's the first step is being able to have a visualization that's going to be easy to process and therefore easy for you to retain and move forward. The second step is something that's going to be fully customizable that you're going to be able to take with you and tweak and modify as you desire. So that is what sharpfootballstats.com is. What it does is it will update this data and this information on a weekly basis after the games conclude. So, for instance, the typical schedule throughout the course of the week is you'll be able to wake up on Monday morning, go to sharpfootballstats.com, and you're going to see visualizations for every single game that just happened on Sunday. And you're going to be able to wake up on Tuesday and you're going to be able to see visualizations for every single game that happened on Monday. And you'll be able to sort them by the whole season. You'll be able to filter individual weeks. You can look at particular matchups when a team, I only want to look at games when this team played, these other divisional opponents, and then you can filter just for their divisional opponents. So there's a lot of different ways that you're going to be able to filter that. But the goal is to have this information to you very quickly and very easily after the games end. So with that said, you go head on over to sharpfootballstats.com, and I'm going to go ahead and give you a couple of quick pointers for using the website, a couple quick tips for when you're at the website right now. All right, so a couple of tips about the website before I start talking about some of the other features here. Number one, when you go to the website, this is built for desktop viewing. That is where you will see it from in its optimized manner. Okay, when you're viewing it on your desktop, you want to be at a display zoom of 100%. Now, if you go to the About tab, you'll see more information about this, but basically you want to set your browser to 100% zoom. The reason is some of these visualizations, they show the football field, they show dimensions and things of that nature, and because they're fully interactive, it's not just a static picture that you can zoom in and out of and it'll always look the same. Because it's a static, because it's dynamic and it will change as you add different data to your selection or choose different teams, you really need to have it set on 100% to view it optimally. You can still zoom out if you prefer that, see all the text a lot smaller and see the image much tinier, and it'll still give you the information, but some features it may not look quite right in terms of the formatting. So it's up to you, but I do recommend for at least optimal viewing that you change your browser to zoom to 100%. So that's number one. Number two, as I mentioned, this is designed for the desktop. There's a lot of data that gets pulled in here and filtered and analyzed, and primarily the visualizations are built for desktop viewing. If you want to check it out for the first time and you just happen to be on your mobile device and you want to check it out, number one, scroll to the bottom of any page and click the link at the bottom there that says View on Desktop. Okay, when you click that link that says View on Desktop, if you're on a mobile device from any page, what it's going to do is it's going to dial up the desktop version of the site. So it's not going to give you all the formatting that typically occurs when you're viewing it on the mobile site. You know how different sites have mobile sites that are a little bit different than desktop sites. So when you're on the desktop site from your iPad or your iPhone or whatever device that you're using, you can then zoom out a little bit easier and see the whole visualization and get a better sense of what it is, what it's going to look like when you are looking at it on your desktop, on your computer, at home, or wherever you are with your computer. You can still utilize it on that device. You can still go choose filters and modify things, and I do it myself. It's pretty convenient. It's not ideal, but it's usable if you actually have it set to view on desktop, and then you can do it a little bit easier like that. If you try to just view it on the mobile device and you don't change it back to desktop, you're not going to be able to zoom in to the right level to see things change, and it's going to be kind of a pain. So those are my two suggestions. Number one, view it on your desktop. If you can't do that, view it on your mobile device, but choose the option at the bottom of any page that says view on desktop. Number two, just general navigation, the way that the site works. I've got offensive statistics housed in one category, defensive statistics housed in another category. Within each category, there's a number of subcategories: passing, receiving, rushing, efficiency and success, toxicity, and play frequency. Within each one of those subcategories, there's a number of visualizations. You can obviously choose the navigation menus to see drop downs of all those different categories and subcategories. The other way to do it, especially if you're just starting out and you don't really know what all the visualizations mean, but you kind of have an idea, like I want to look at something that looks like this, I suggest just click the main offense button or the main defense button. And when you click the main offense button, you will see all the subcategories listed on one page, as well as thumbnail pictures of every single visualization. So you'll have an exact notion of this is what exactly I'm going to get when I go to this particular page or statistic. When you do that, let's say you want to look at a particular stat in a little bit more detail, click that thumbnail and an image will pop up. It'll show you exactly the detail of what you want to look at. And when you do that, there's a little chain link in the bottom right. It's obviously a link icon that's telling you to go to that page. If you like this image and you want to go to that page, just click the chain link on the bottom right and it'll instantly take you to that particular visualization. So that's a definite shortcut in terms of getting a better understanding of what's on the website and where it's located, is just by clicking offense or defense and looking at the overall layout. The second thing is that so far I've done it for all the offensive pages. I'll add it to the defensive pages as well. I've included a video tutorial for every single statistic page that's there. Every single subcategory has its own video tutorial. And the video tutorial is me walking you through what you're getting out of this particular visualization and what the different menu filtering options do and how you can process this data, what it all means to you, and how helpful it will be, things that you can use this visualization for, things of that nature. So go to a page, check out the tutorial video, play around with the actual visualization a little bit, and I think that between that and the thumbnails is really going to help you get a better and quicker understanding as to what this site can do and what you can use it for. The next thing I want to talk to you about is this concept that I came up with, which is called the Sharp box score. We all know what box scores look like. We've all seen box scores. Obviously, they used to print them up in the newspapers at one point in time. Now you can go to any of the main sites and look up what the box scores are, or you can download the playbook and review those. But one thing that those are simply not going to give you is they're not going to give you success rates. They're not going to give you average first down rates. They're not going to give you a lot of the other interesting metrics that are going to be automatically calculated, such as run rate, pass rates, things of that nature. You just have to kind of do extra math to them. At sharpfootballstats.com, you can go to the Sharp box score, and all that information is going to be there at your fingertips. You can choose what week you want to look at and what matchup went on that week. Then you're going to see the teams, their line, the total on the game, and you're going to see all the statistics that you could hope to find. There's I don't really need to repeat what all is here from the tutorial perspective about how you can utilize it, but there's an overall section that's going to talk about just general team stats and team passing and rushing. Then there's team efficiency performance, and you can actually filter these things. You can filter, for instance, say you want to look at passing stats, but only when they were in shotgun, or you want to look at only no huddle snaps versus huddle snaps. You can look at that as well, and you just click the filter and instantly you're going to see the updated efficiency metrics. You can look at team efficiency performance by down, and you can choose, then you can filter, do I want to only look at run plays based upon their down, or do I want to look at pass plays, or all? You can filter by quarter, so you can look at how they did in the first half versus the second half. You can look at how they did in short yardage situations, long yardage situations, all that with just the click of one button to choose the filter and change that setting. You can look at how a team performed over the course of the field, so in the field zone report. So for example, If you instantly want to see how many successful plays they ran when they were inside their opponent's red zone, you can instantly see that. You can see how many first downs they gained inside their opponent's red zone and how many TDs they scored or turnovers they had. And then you could filter that by only looking at pass or run, or you can look at based upon quarter. So there's a lot of things that you can do with it that are very basic, standardized, so that you don't have to do a lot of work. You can just click a drop down. The other thing that I just added to this box score is player efficiency, performance, and usage. Now that's obviously more in line with what you typically find on regular box scores, but it's still giving you a lot of things that aren't captured on regular box scores, such as successful play rate, average first down rate, the number of first downs that a particular receiver had, how many explosive plays they gained, and a custom analytic that I created called Tours. And there's more information on that at the website, but that's basically a usage and efficiency statistic, primarily helpful for quarterbacks and or wide receivers, and it's primarily designed more so for fantasy usage in terms of how effective this particular player was in this game. It's not calculating like fantasy points that they produced, but it's calculating based upon successful play rates as well as number of times that the player was utilized. So those are two things that are most likely, in my opinion, to carry onward into the future. If a player is heavily utilized and those results were successful, that team is more likely to utilize this player moving forward into the future. If a player was utilized but it was very unsuccessful, then you have to wonder if they're still going to continue with the same strategy, if it had to do with matchups, if you can expect better things next week or worse things next week. And then obviously it'll degrade players for being underutilized, but for instance, a couple of really successful plays, but he's hardly used at all. That'll degrade that guy a little bit because he's hardly used at all, and you may want to bypass him, even though his stats might have been pretty good for that particular week. A lot of fantasy production and whatnot is based upon, in terms of scoring and what you want to target, is in terms of usage rates. So at any rate, we look at targets and completions and yards and successful play rates, and you can filter all of these things again by down, if you want to look at how they did on certain downs, by quarter, by field zone, and by yards to go. There's rushing reports, receiving reports, and quarterback reports for these player efficiency, performance, and usage metrics at the bottom. So I really think that this Sharp box score is going to be very easy because not only does it give you the numbers and the stats that you can then cite in articles you can reference to later on and use in comparison with other players, but what it also does is every single line item on here, every single player, every single field zone location, down, play type, has a color-coded efficiency metric next to it that'll show you exactly visually how successful this particular team was or player was based upon the filtering options that you've selected. So every single one has a visualized success indicator, so you can see if they're red or for bad or green for good, obviously. So I really think that you guys are going to like the Sharp box score. I don't think you'll see anything else out there like it. One thing that I want to mention before we move on and start talking about some of the games themselves, even though that's going to be an abbreviated segment compared to usual, what we'll have in the upcoming weeks, I did want to mention that at sharpfootballstats.com, this project is just in its infancy. This project just got started. I will take no offense for any suggestions, ways to improve it, ideas that you may have for either a brand new visualization or modification to an existing visualization, maybe adding some type of data point to an existing visualization or another choice for a particular filtering option on a particular visualization if you think it might be helpful and it can explain why you want it. So in all cases, just go to the contact page at sharpfootballstats.com, fill out the form, and let me know what your suggestion is. Again, I built this because I wanted to utilize it myself to better understand what I'm seeing on a weekly basis from football. That is going to be useful for you guys as well. But this website, obviously, I put it up here publicly. I could have just kept all this data to myself and run it on the back end and analyzed everything on a weekly basis myself. But I'm putting it up here so that you guys can gain the benefit of its existence and the revolutionary, in my opinion, ideas that we've got through these visualizations to better understand this sport of football and the game that they play in the NFL on Sundays. So my hope is that this is going to be helpful for you. And if there's ways that I can improve that, let me know. I cannot do everything, and I'm certainly not going to be able to do all of the suggestions that are tossed out to me, but no suggestion, any suggestion is better than no suggestion. If I can incorporate it, implement it, I will. If I can't, then that may be tabled to the future. Maybe it's a horrible idea, but I will never tell you that's a horrible idea. Any idea, just feel free to shoot it over to me. Some ideas might be good that I'll have to implement down the road. Some ideas might be good that I can incorporate tomorrow. There's no end to what we could do with this website. And ultimately, I think that, to be honest with you, as I wrote in my football preview, this information is going to be useful for NFL teams to break down their opponents, to study their opponents for the upcoming weeks, to study their own tendencies and ways that they can improve. And obviously, NFL teams already have a ton of information at their fingertips that they use and break down. So maybe these statistics necessarily aren't something new that they've never seen before, but the ability to easily understand what the statistics means by seeing them on the football field overlaid, or seeing their success rates overlaid instantly by down and distance, and the fact that you can use the color coding to instantly understand, here's where we're great, here's where we need work, here's where we should attack this other team. Those types of things. This is their strategy on, they like to go for their chunk plays in these locations on the field, on these downs. Like, these are all things that you can get from this website that you'll be able to utilize if you're a football team in the NFL, and probably, hopefully, get smarter and more intelligent and better be able to scheme and game plan. So I have no doubt that down the road, things like that will be of interest to teams. In the meantime, let's develop this thing to make your life and my life better. Let's use this as a tool that we can use to better understand the game of football, to pull in more information, and by understanding it, we're going to be able to predict results better. And I don't care what the reason that you're wanting to predict results for. Maybe you're playing daily fantasy, maybe you're betting on these games, maybe you're just sitting at home, maybe you're working for a team. In any of those realms, the more information that we have that's useful and that we can understand quickly, the better off we'll be when we try to predict results. And being accurate when we predict results is the ultimate goal here. So feel free to go to the contact page at Sharp Football Stats and feel free to share any and all feedback, positive or negative. All right, let's first talk, when we're dealing with last week's games, I just want to talk about high level a couple of concepts. And the first one was a couple of coaches that I thought did a tremendous job to help their team win when their most critical component was out of the game, and that was their starting quarterback. And for this particular example, we're going to talk about Bill Belichick and Mike Zimmer. So let's first talk about what Bill Belichick did. Now, the first things first, in this game against the Arizona Cardinals, the Patriots lost 2 fumbles. Now, we know that they rarely lose fumbles, at least historically, since 2007, night and day above the rest of the league at retaining the football. But they lost 2 fumbles in this game. So they were -2 overall in turnover margin. So that's a key indicator. Teams do not usually fare very well when they're -2 in turnovers, unless they get a ridiculous sack rating on the opposing quarterback. Maybe they produce tremendously inside the red zone. And in neither case, they did either of those two things. They had 1 more sack than the Arizona Cardinals did, but they only had 3 total. They got to the red zone only twice and converted once. The Cardinals got to their red zone 3 times and converted all 3 times into touchdown. And the Cardinals were better at staying out of third down. So all those indicators would dictate that the Arizona Cardinals should have and could have won this football game. But they ended up losing it by 2. And we know that the Patriots led at the half by 3. And so in the second half, the Cardinals tried, they might only were able to chip into that lead by 1 point and lost by 2. So there's one key, though, that I want to bring up, and that relates to third down performance. Now, we know that I love early down success rate, early down performance. It's a key indicator for winning games. However, the Patriots were very unsuccessful in the early downs, and a large part of that has to do with their ability to run the football, particularly on early downs. If you look at the team overall in terms of what they did when they ran the football, and you can actually go to, I'm actually just pulling up stuff here on sharpfootballstats.com as I'm talking to you to cite some of these numbers. But overall, if you look at LeGarrette Blount, he averages 3.2 yards per carry. Only 23% of his runs were successful. 23%. So that's very bad. When you just filter out and look at only early down runs for LeGarrette Blount, what you'll see is that he averaged only 2.7 yards per carry. They handed him the ball 20 times, and only 20% of those were successful on first or second down. That put the Patriots in a very difficult spot offensively from a passing perspective. They faced third down and long a somewhat fair amount of time, and Jimmy Garoppolo still performed extremely well in those situations. He posted on his third down passer rating over the course of the entire game. Let me pull it up here. On third down, Jimmy Garoppolo, a 103 passer rating. He completed 73% of his passes. 64% of his passes were successful on third down. Now, that is extremely strong, especially when you think about what Bill Belichick was able to do to Carson Palmer on third down and what Belichick's defense did. When Palmer dropped back and passed the ball, his passer rating was a 73, and he completed just 56% of his passes. Only 33% were graded as successful. So Jimmy Garoppolo, night and day, better than Carson Palmer, and Carson Palmer had a much better early down rushing attack than did Jimmy Garoppolo. Now, I mentioned earlier the fact that In the second half, the Patriots were able to maintain their lead, and they led it 10-7 at half, and they still won the game by 2 points. If you look at what they did in the second half from a play calling perspective and from a usage perspective, LeGarrette Blount only averaged 2.8 yards per carry. Only 25% of his runs were successful in the second half. So they still couldn't get anything done. The Arizona Cardinals really focused on shutting down the run game of the Patriots, and they were very successful at doing that. So the burden fell on Jimmy Garoppolo, and he completed 78% of his passes in the second half, 96 passer rating, and 56% of his plays were graded as successful. Now, that's a really big stat, and particularly I want to focus what he did on third down. On third down in the second half, he averaged 14.4 yards per attempt, completed 80% of his passes, obviously 80% success rate in that particular case, and a 119 passer rating. So in the second half, when it mattered the most, and they needed him to pass the football, and they were behind the sticks in terms of down and distance, he was able to get the job done. So that comes primarily, obviously, Bill Belichick has been spending this entire training camp trying to coach him up, trying to get him ready. Obviously, he's been in the system, but the New England Patriots were just very inefficient overall on the ground, and they're also inefficient inside of the red zone. They didn't even get down to the red zone all that much, but the reality was it was their ability to perform and execute on third down that allowed their offense to stay out on the field, kept their defense on the sideline, and allowed them to keep working, and they ended up controlling time of possession. They had the 7th most time of possession of any team in the NFL this past week. All right, the second game that we want to discuss is the Minnesota Vikings versus the Tennessee Titans. And from this perspective, we want to focus in on what Mike Zimmer did. And what Mike Zimmer's influence was in this game. Obviously, we know that they were without their quarterback, and so, Teddy Bridgewater. And unlike Bill Belichick and his ability to spend the entire training camp with the understanding that it's likely Brady was going to miss the first 4 weeks and get Jimmy Garoppolo ready, the Minnesota Vikings found out late that they weren't going to have Teddy Bridgewater due to that late injury. They didn't have a guy like a Jimmy Garoppolo around. Their backup quarterback was the older veteran who might have been able to fill in for a game or two, but still may have lost that game. There's no counting on the fact that he was going to win those games. He's old. At one point, he was a serviceable backup, but it appeared like those days may have passed him by. Because in this particular game, he only completed 55% of his passes, a 77 rating, no touchdowns, 42% of his passes were successful. So a very poor performance from Sean Hill. But the big difference is what ended up happening after halftime. So by studying Sharp Football Stats, we can look at some of the first half statistics to understand what the status was heading into the locker room. But what we know is that the Tennessee Titans were up by 10 points. Marcus Mariota had thrown 62% of his passes successfully, and he posted a 99 passer rating. On the ground, the interesting part when you start looking at success rates as opposed to just yards per carry, you'll find out that the Tennessee Titans were actually successful running the football in the first half. Now, the stats won't bear it out. DeMarco Murray averaged only 3.6 yards per carry. Derrick Henry only 2.3 yards per carry. So these guys weren't having great fantasy days for anybody out there. But in terms of what they needed to get on those down and distances when they were handed the football, DeMarco Murray was successful 56% of the time, and Derrick Henry was successful 67% of the time on 2 out of his 3 carries. So these guys both posted very successful rates. Contrast that with a guy like Adrian Peterson, who was successful just 44% of his carries in the first half. So you have Marcus Mariota playing well. You have a running game that, while it's not gaining a ton of yards, is being very successful when they do hand the football off to them. And obviously from out of the backfield, they were having a lot of success passing the football to DeMarco Murray and Tajay Sharp. Both were targeted 6 times. Both had 67% success rates when they were targeted. And you have overall a very strong offensive performance. Now, we know what happens in the second half. Minnesota scores a couple of touchdowns based upon turnovers. One was a fumble recovery where they got after Marcus Mariota and the snap exchange was messed up and they got it. And another one was a pick six. So 2 big plays. Obviously, you're going to... when you have non-offensive touchdowns, which is what a defensive touchdown is considered, or any type of return touchdown, that helps tremendously. And then when you're +3 in turnovers, of course, you can almost forget about it. It's very hard for an opponent to win a game if you're -3 in turnover margin like the Titans were, and the other team has 2 return touchdowns where their offense isn't even on the field when they're scoring touchdowns. It's very difficult to overcome that. But I think the other thing to focus here on, because we know Tennessee started out the second half with a 10-point lead, is the simple fact that look at the production from the Titans offense once Mike Zimmer made some halftime adjustments. DeMarco Murray and Derrick Henry totaled 6 yards rushing in the second half. They were successful on less than 25% combined. DeMarco Murray was 25%, Derrick Henry was 0% on his runs. Passing the football, Marcus Mariota though he was successful on 55% of his passes, still only posted a 64 passer rating in the second half and only averaged 4.8 yards per attempt. So in large part due to what Mike Zimmer was able to do defensively at halftime to frustrate this Tennessee Titans offense, which had been extremely efficient in the first half, not from a big yards perspective, but from an overall efficiency perspective in building their 10-point lead, to a team that really couldn't do anything, couldn't get out of its own way, couldn't get the job accomplished. That was a big deal for the Minnesota Vikings and for Mike Zimmer's coaching. And it really made a big difference in terms of their overall performance and their ability to win the game. Of course, the turnovers and non-offensive touchdowns ultimately is what got the job done, but you cannot count on those things moving forward, however. So when you look at this upcoming game that they have this week against the Green Bay Packers, I'm excited to see Zimmer. I'm excited to see what his halftime adjustments are going to be in the locker room on Sunday night in Minnesota's home opener. That's what's really going to intrigue me, because we know how fast Green Bay typically likes to start the first and second half. They like to get off to very fast starts in the first and third quarters. And so it's going to be interesting to see in that third quarter, once Zimmer makes his halftime adjustments, what ends up happening. But I can tell you this much. I'll be shocked if the Vikings are +3 in turnovers and +2 in non-offensive touchdowns. So they're going to have to figure out another way to produce points effectively and get off to a good start in the first half. You can maybe hope that Zimmer makes some good halftime adjustments to slow down the Packers offense in the second half, but unless you offensively can start out the game on a good note, it's going to be difficult. So Norv Turner needs to figure out something to help the pass game in the first half as well as the run game in the first half, because those really both were completely absent in their game in Tennessee this past week. And to put it mildly, I mean, even in the second half, if you look at what Adrian Peterson did, he had 10 rushes for 1.1 yards per carry in the second half. Only 20% of his runs were successful. So we all know from watching the highlights, and whoever had AP on their teams this week, he was absolutely pathetic. So they're going to need to fix that against the Green Bay Packers, and they're going to need to have some threat of a downfield passing game, which could give some space to Adrian Peterson. Without that threat downfield, they're not really going to, nobody's really going to respect the run game enough to, or the pass game enough to divert resources from stopping the run and stopping Adrian Peterson. All right, the next subject that I want to talk about is sort of a changing of the guard, potentially a passing of the torch. I don't really know the right way to describe it, because I don't think either of these teams is going to win the division. But in the NFC South, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers against the Atlanta Falcons. If you're a client of mine, you obviously know we had a good opening week. We won 4 out of 5 recommendations. One of the games was on the Buccaneers +3 over the Atlanta Falcons. But you should know heading into it that I was down on the Atlanta Falcons to begin with. I took them under their season win total. And so I looked at this game, and one thing really stood out to me, and that is the manner, because if you look at just the overall passing statistics, you're not going to see it there. Overall passing statistics, Jameis Winston a 123 passer rating, Matt Ryan a 111 passer rating. They both passed for right around 8.5, 8.3 yards per pass attempt. They both completed about 70% of their passes. So you're not really going to see the difference in statistics there. You are going to notice that neither team could run the football. The Bucs averaged only 3.2 yards per carry. The Falcons averaged only 2.4 yards per carry. And I anticipated that the Falcons were going to struggle running the football here. I did think that the Tampa Bay Bucs would have better success running on the Atlanta Falcons, but they did not. So what that meant is it had to come down to Jameis Winston. And that's where I'm going to flip back over here as I'm talking to my computer, and I'm going to sharpfootballstats.com. And down in the player efficiency, performance, and usage section, I want to look at some of these red zone statistics and then one other stat just outside of the red zone. So one of the things that you can see here is that the Atlanta Falcons were very mediocre in red zone passing. While Matt Ryan was 6 of 8, he averaged only 1.8 yards per pass attempt inside the red zone. So what was he doing with the ball? He posted a 117 passer rating and they recorded 1 touchdown. But what is he doing with the ball? Well, he's throwing a couple 3-yard completions to Devonta Freeman. He's throwing a 3-yard completion to Jacob Tamme. He's attempting to pass to Tevin Coleman. He's completing a pass to Justin Hardy for no yards. His longest pass was to Mohamed Sanu. And Sanu, he was targeted twice. He caught both times for 4.5 yards on average. So there were not very many risks taken in the passing game for Atlanta inside the red zone. And you'll note that they went 1 of 4 in red zone conversions. So they were taking a lot of short passes. They were not really getting very aggressive down close to the scoring area. And so forget Matt Ryan's at this point, his 117 rating, because he did throw a touchdown in only 8 attempts inside the red zone. His average yards per pass were terrible. Let's contrast that with looking at Jameis Winston. Now, Jameis Winston, 1 of 1 inside the red zone for 4 yards. It was a touchdown pass. He posted a 123 rating. That's great. I think the bigger takeaway is that he only attempted 1 pass inside the red zone. And you ask, well, why did he only attempt 1 pass inside the red zone? The answer is if you filter for what he was doing from around his own 40 up to just the edge of the red zone, up to the 21-yard line, you'll find that is where Winston absolutely destroyed the Atlanta Falcons defense. 71% of Winston's passes were successful out of 14 passes. He averaged 13.4 yards per attempt. And from this distance, so outside the red zone, all the way back to just on the other side of midfield, that's where they had 3 passing touchdowns. Okay, so Winston was heaving the ball down the field. They were getting very aggressive with their pass game, chunking up big yardage plays. He had 5 explosive pass plays in just 14 attempts. Matt Ryan had 18 attempts in the same field zones, but only had 3 explosive passes. So Winston was throwing the ball more downfield. He was having more success with his accuracy, and they were producing points in a big manner. And that's really how they were able to break this game open in the second half. So, kudos to Jameis Winston and what he is doing. I was expecting and hoping, I'm a neutral fan. I don't care who wins games as long as my results are accurate enough. I can learn from inaccurate results, but I love being accurate when I can be. And in this case, I was really hoping that we were going to see the development and furthering of Jameis Winston. And I was concerned, frankly, about what I had seen from Matt Ryan. And Matt Ryan has done nothing to dissuade me from that. Whereas Jameis Winston, this is where I'm saying I think maybe this is almost like a torch passing game. He started off slowly, but the aggressive nature that he had, particularly down right around midfield and to the edge of the red zone, if you can throw touchdown passes from that distance, if you can get accurate with your passes to hit 71%, even though you're going way down the field, because there weren't a whole lot of just dump offs to a running back where the running back was taking it, 30 yards. There was a couple of those, but for the most part, if you want to look at what they were doing, he completed half of his pass attempts to Vincent Jackson. He completed 2 out of 3 pass attempts to Mike Evans for 72 yards, so an average of 24 yards per attempt to Mike Evans. He had a couple of longer attempts to Charles Sims, where Charles Sims did a lot of running after he caught the ball, but those were only 13 and a half. His other big chunk play that came from a touchdown was Austin Seferian-Jenkins, a 30-yarder to Austin Seferian-Jenkins. So that aggressive nature, I think, is really going to help Jameis Winston's confidence, especially doing that on the road, and hopefully it will carry on for him over the course of the season. Looking at the Jacksonville Jaguars versus the Green Bay Packers, I wanted to mention this game in particular because we know the storyline and the narrative that had surrounded Aaron Rodgers last year. Though a lot of the criticism is undeserved, the reality is that Aaron Rodgers started off the season, I think it was the first 6 or 7 weeks, with the NFL's best passer rating of any quarterback, and the Green Bay Packers won a ton of games. Then they go out to play Denver in prime time, and Aaron Rodgers got destroyed like a rag doll behind the line of scrimmage. And whether he got hurt in that game or in the Carolina Panthers game to follow, he played much worse the rest of that season after getting beat up in that particular game, and then he had to get off-season knee surgery. So I was interested to see what he would look like to start this year after the off-season knee surgery, having Jordy Nelson back in the flock, and what they were going to be able to do offensively. The reality is they were not nearly as explosive as they need to be. And let's go ahead and dig into some of those stats in a minute. First, let's talk high level in this game. Neither team very successful at running the football. The Jaguars obviously had hoped that they were going to be able to run the football a little bit more this year, help support Blake Bortles. They tried to run it a lot. They ran it 26 times. They gained just 48 yards, 1.8 yards per carry. The Green Bay Packers, not a lot better. They did gain almost twice the number of yards, but it still was only 3.8 yards per carry, which is not good. By the way, the Jaguars, 1.8 yards per carry, the worst in the NFL last week. So when you look then at the burden fell more so on the quarterbacks, but the reality is, if you go over to the Sharp box score and check out that box score, you'll notice that neither of these teams performed very well on first and second down. Not well at all. So their early on success rates were poor. That's why they faced a lot of third downs. And the big difference here was that the Jaguars converted just 27% of their third downs, while the Green Bay Packers converted 50% of their third downs. So that was pretty much the difference in this game. But let's go ahead and dig into some of the numbers a little bit more. And you could see that, the Jacksonville Jaguars, when they were passing the football on third down, converted just 17% of their 12 pass attempts into first downs, the 2 out of 12. So that was a very, very, very bad number. Meanwhile, the Green Bay Packers converted 5 out of 11, so 45%. So still not great, but significantly better than what the Jacksonville Jaguars were at. And so that third down rate went very far in this game, in what ended up being a game where neither team could do anything inside the red zone, particularly in the second half, where they were just kicking field goals back and forth, trading those points, and the Green Bay Packers were able to win the game by 4 points. So if we look at how these players did just overall on early downs, because we mentioned why they had to go into third down a lot, one key thing I need to mention about Aaron Rodgers is that on first and second down, he completed just 54% of his passes for only 4.1 yards per attempt. It was a 78 passer rating. And here's the big number in my opinion. 24 attempts, 0 explosive passes. So they were unable to get the ball down the field at all. We know that Aaron Rodgers, whether it's the first half, the second half, in early downs, like this is not an offense that waits until third down and just chucks it long. This is an offense that gets aggressive from the beginning. So the simple fact that they had 0 explosive passes on first and second down the entire game is a problem. Now, Jordy Nelson was targeted the most of any receiver on first and second down. Aaron Rodgers did complete 5 of 6 attempts to him, but only 50% of those plays were successful, and they averaged only 4 yards per attempt. I'm not sure when, if ever, Jordy Nelson last year, he wasn't there last year, but the year before that, his last healthy year, ever had a time when he had 5 catches but averaged only 4 yards, which is what he did in first and second down in this particular game. Devontae Adams, 4 attempts towards him, only 5.3 yards per attempt. Randall Cobb, 4 attempts towards him, only 3.8 yards per attempt. So the Green Bay Packers absolutely must find a way to open things up more offensively and let Aaron Rodgers throw the ball down the field and get more success out of that, because that is a significant problem. It's one of the things that this team has done well over the years, is get some of those big chunks. And we know that this team has kind of struggled to run the football a little bit. And here's the big thing about the Sunday night game against Minnesota. We know that Minnesota has a very, very well coached, very sound defense. We know that Minnesota was able to hold the Tennessee Titans down in the run game. In the first half, as I mentioned earlier, the runs were a little bit more successful, but they still didn't generate very many yards. In the second half, the runs for the Titans were unsuccessful and did not generate yards. So that's what the Green Bay Packers are going to be staring at in the face this upcoming Sunday night in Minnesota when they have their home opener in their new stadium. Green Bay absolutely must figure out a way on first and second down to get some more chunk yardage out of their passing game. Now, whether it's Aaron Rodgers feeling uncomfortable behind that line, we obviously know that they got rid of one of their linemen right before the season started. Whether he's uncomfortable behind that line, whether the plays aren't being dialed up correctly, whether the deep shots that he's attempting just are going incomplete because he's not on the same page with his receivers, is probably a combination of all of those. But it doesn't matter what the reason is. They need to make a change, and they need to figure out how they're going to be able to get Aaron Rodgers to throw the ball down the field on first and second down to stretch out this Minnesota Vikings defense. Because if they are not getting enough attempts down the field, if they're targeting Jordy Nelson 6 times, but 5 of those are gaining only an average of 4 yards per attempt because he caught 5 of them, this is not the recipe to open up that Minnesota Vikings defense at home. And I am anticipating that there's going to be a ridiculous level of crowd noise in this dome. I believe the stadium, if I'm not mistaken, has some acoustic features that are reflecting some of the noise back down on the field, kind of like they have in Seattle. So I think that this stadium is going to be super, super loud, and it's going to be difficult for that offense to operate. Now, Aaron Rodgers can operate no huddle. He can operate silent count, very effectively. One of the best in the NFL, so at least he's got that going for him. But they need to open things up, especially against the Jacksonville Jaguars defense, that while they got some new pieces, it's going to be difficult for me to believe that this Jacksonville Jaguars defense is as good as it was week 1 against Aaron Rodgers. If Jacksonville's defense is as good that they can hold Aaron Rodgers and the Packers to 199 yards passing and hold them to just 3.8 yards rushing, then I may have underestimated what the Jacksonville Jaguars defense will be this year and how helpful that will be for them. But I have a feeling that that is more of an aberration and more the result of what Aaron Rodgers needed to work on than it was how tremendous the Jacksonville Jaguars defense has gotten in just one offseason with acquisitions. So that's the take on Aaron Rodgers and what they need to do and improve immediately heading into their big game Sunday night for the lead in the NFC North. And that's going to go ahead and do it for the Week 1 recap edition of this podcast. I'm going to go ahead and break down the games for you guys this upcoming weekend. We're going to talk to Evan Silva Friday night, and we're going to get that podcast up to you as soon as we possibly can on Saturday morning, where we're going to be able to dive into a lot of these great matchups. We have, as we mentioned earlier, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who are leading the NFC South right now. They're the number 1 team in that division, with all the other 3 teams having lost this past week. And they're traveling out to Arizona, who's in desperate need of a win, given the fact that Seattle started off 1-0 at home, albeit not in outstanding fashion. But there's no chance that Arizona can drop 2 games to start the season, both of them being at home. So that is a big game for the Arizona Cardinals, even though it's just week 2 and it's a home game. But there's some pretty intriguing games. I'm really looking forward to this Sunday night game, Green Bay and Minnesota. I'm looking forward to seeing this battle between San Diego and Jacksonville on the West Coast, as we've got two teams that both lost last week. Both teams have really high expectations this year, and so that's going to be a very competitive game, in my opinion. There's just a number of decent games on the slate. I doubt that this card's going to be nearly as good as it was week one, because it's going to be virtually impossible to live up to, but I will go ahead and break these games down with you in detail with Evan Silva on Friday night. So until then, have a great rest of the week, guys. Please check out sharpfootballstats.com and feel free to share some of your feedback in the comment section. If you like it, if you enjoy where it's at, go ahead and tell people on Twitter. Go ahead and spread the word for that. Also, make sure that you're subscribing to this podcast. As you know, the schedule is really going to start ramping up next week. We're going to be starting this Periscope on Monday night at 8 p.m. Eastern, so stay on the lookout for that. We're going to do a Whiteboard Wednesday edition. So we've got a lot of podcasts that are going to be coming out here in the coming weeks. So make sure you're subscribing on iTunes, Sharp Football Analysis Podcast. You can also subscribe on YouTube. And until we talk and you see the podcast up there on Saturday morning, hope you guys have a great rest of the week.
No.